Imagine your mother standing at the kitchen table in 1943, holding a pound of something that looked like lard, white, pale, lifeless, and in her other hand, a tiny capsule no bigger than a pea filled with golden orange dye. She had to break it, knead it, work it into that pale block with her own hands until it looked like butter. Because butter was gone. And this little capsule, it was the only thing standing between your family and a table that felt like wartime had already won. But hidden inside that capsule was a rule most families never understood. A quiet control, a choice that wasn't really theirs at all. There are objects from the war years that slip through memory. Things we don't talk about much anymore. Not the big things, the ration books, the victory gardens, the telegrams. But the smaller things, the quiet ones, the ones tucked into kitchen drawers, rolled into aprons, or hidden in the back of the icebox. One of those things was a capsule, a tiny, soft gelatin bead, orange, oily, fragile. It came inside every pound of margarine sold during World War II. And if you were there, if you lived through those years, you might still remember the feel of it between your fingers, the way it broke under pressure, the way the color bled into the pale, greasy block your mother worked with both hands, kneading and folding, until that whitish margarine started to look, just barely, like butter. Your grandmother probably did this. Maybe your mother. Maybe even you, if you were old enough to help. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something people talked about with pride. But it was necessary. Because butter was rationed. Butter was scarce. Butter was saved for the soldiers, for the hospitals, for the war effort. And what was left at home? This pale substitute, this margarine, this block of something that tasted like oil and looked like soap unless you did the work, unless you used the capsule. But here's what most families didn't know. Hidden inside the rules about that capsule, about how it was sold, where it came from, why it was even legal, was a quiet battle. A battle fought not with guns, but with butter. A battle between farmers and factories, between tradition and necessity, between what America wanted and what America could afford to keep. And the capsule? The capsule was the compromise, but the most overlooked rule about this little bead of dye would come later. Margarine wasn't new in 1943. It had been around since the 1800s, invented in France, brought to America, and quietly sold in the shadows of the butter industry for decades. It was cheaper. It was made from vegetable oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn. It didn't need cows. It didn't need cream. It didn't need pastures or barns or dairy farmers working before dawn. But it had a problem. It was white, pale, waxy, unappetizing white. It looked like lard. It looked like something you'd grease a pan with, not spread on toast. And because of there at the kitchen counter, others saved it, waiting until Sunday when they'd color a week's worth all at once. A few handed the job to their children, older girls mostly, who learned to press and fold without complaint, who learned not to waste, not to stain their hands too much, not to ask why real butter couldn't just come back. It became part of the rhythm of the week. Monday, wash. Tuesday, mend. Wednesday, Color the margarine. The capsule itself was delicate. If you squeezed too hard, it burst before you were ready. If you didn't press enough, the dye stayed in clumps, leaving the margarine streaked, half white, half orange. If you got the dye on your hands, it didn't wash off easily. Your fingers stayed faintly yellow for hours. Your nails looked stained. Some families didn't bother coloring it at all. They used it white. Pale and strange on the dinner table, but edible, functional. Nobody talked about it. But most families did color it. Because even in wartime, even with rations and shortages and fear, there was a need, a quiet, stubborn need, to make things feel normal. To sit down at the table and see something that looked like butter. To not feel every single meal like you were losing. Rose Callahan colored the margarine every Sunday after Mass. She'd set the block on a plate, drop the capsule on top, and work it with a wooden spoon first, then her hands. The children watched from the doorway sometimes. Mary, the youngest, always asked the same question. "When's butter coming back, Mama?" And Rose always gave the same answer. "When the war's over, sweetheart." But she didn't know if that was true. In 1943 alone, the U.S. government rationed butter to just 4 ounces per person per week. Half a stick. For a family of 5, that was barely enough for breakfast toast, let alone cooking or baking. Margarine sales tripled. By 1944, Americans were consuming nearly 300 million pounds of margarine a year, and every single pound came with a capsule. You felt the weight of it in small ways, the way your mother's hand smelled faintly of vegetable oil, the way the margarine never quite melted the same as butter. It pooled, separated, left a slick on your plate. The way your grandmother, visiting from the farm, refused to touch it. She'd rather go without. "That's not food," she'd mutter. "That's factory grease." But it was food. It had to be, because butter was gone. And the capsule? The capsule was the compromise you made every week to pretend it wasn't. But then, something most families didn't realize was already happening. Something about where that margarine came from and who controlled it. Not everyone had the same access to margarine. In the cities, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, grocery stores kept it stocked. You could find it if you had the ration stamps. You could buy it, take it home, color it, use it. It wasn't butter, but it was something. But in rural areas, in small farming towns where dairy cows still grazed in, pastures and fresh milk was churned into butter every week, margarine was harder to find. And in some places, it wasn't just hard to find, it was illegal, even during the war. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and several other dairy states maintained strict laws. You couldn't sell yellow margarine. You couldn't serve it in restaurants. You couldn't even bring it across state lines, in some cases without risking a fine. The dairy lobby was powerful. Farmers argued that margarine was a threat to their livelihoods, that it undermined real food, that it wasn't American. And so, even as soldiers overseas ate margarine in their mess kits, even as housewives in Boston and Baltimore colored it every Sunday, dairy farmers fought to keep it out of their states. It created a quiet divide. Urban families, who had no choice, learned to accept margarine. They learned the routine of the capsule, the kneading, the pale yellow that never quite looked right. But rural families, especially those with connections to dairy farms, looked down on it. They saw it as something shameful, something wartime forced on people who didn't know better. There was pride in butter and shame in the capsule. Rose Callahan felt it once, sharply, when her sister visited from the countryside outside Lancaster. Her sister had brought a small crock of butter, real butter, pale gold, creamy and soft. She set it on the table during Sunday dinner like a gift, like a treasure. "We still have enough," she said, not unkindly, "for family." Rose looked at the margarine on her own table, the streaks of orange still visible where she hadn't kneaded long enough. She felt her face flush. "We do fine," Rose said quietly. Her sister didn't answer, but Mary, watching from the corner, saw the way her mother's jaw tightened, the way she didn't touch the real butter even when it was offered. And then there was the black market, not violent, not dangerous, but real. Butter became currency. Ration stamps for butter could be traded, sold, hoarded. In some neighborhoods, you could buy butter under the table, no stamps required, for double or triple the legal price. People did it. Not everyone, but enough. And margarine? Margarine capsules were sometimes sold separately. A small black market trade developed, capsules alone, no margarine, for families who wanted to stretch what they had. Color water and oil into something that looked richer, make a little go further. It wasn't common, but it happened. In November 1943, a small protest occurred in Milwaukee. Housewives gathered outside the state capitol, holding signs that read, "Let us color our own margarine," and "Butter for all" or "Margarine for all." They weren't asking for luxury. They were asking for fairness. For the right to buy margarine that didn't require 10 minutes of kneading just to look edible. The law didn't change. The dairy lobby was too strong, and margarine, colored or not, remained controversial, controlled, and quietly divisive. But then smiled. But her hands, resting on the table, were trembling. It wasn't just about butter. It wasn't just about margarine. It was about the feeling, the creeping, constant feeling that there was never quite enough, that every meal required a decision, a calculation, a small surrender. And the capsule? The capsule was just the visible part, the part you could hold, the part you could see. But what it represented, the control, the compromise, the quiet weight of it all, that was something else entirely. Yet even as families struggled, something else was building, something that would outlast the war itself. The war ended in August 1945. The telegram stopped. The factory slowed. The soldiers came home. And butter? Butter came back. Slowly. Not all at once. Rationing didn't end overnight. It took months, into 1946, before butter became widely available again. Before the ration stamps were no longer needed. Before the dairy cases filled up with golden blocks wrapped in waxed paper, stamped with farm names. Cold and creamy and real. Rose Callahan bought her first pound of real butter in November 1945. She carried it home like something precious. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table. No capsule inside, no kneading required, just butter. Mary, watching, said softly, "It looks different." "It is different," Rose said, and she spread it on bread, thick, generous, and handed it to her daughter. Mary took a bite, and she smiled. But here's the thing. Even after butter came back, margarine didn't go away. Millions of families had spent 3 years using it, learning to color it, learning to cook with it, learning that it was cheaper, much cheaper, than butter. And for families still recovering from the war, still stretching paychecks, still making do, margarine stayed. The capsule stayed too. For another decade, in states where yellow margarine was still restricted, the capsule remained standard. You bought the margarine white. You colored it yourself. You did the work. It wasn't until the 1950s, state by state, year by year, that the laws finally changed. That margarine could be sold pre-colored, that the capsule became unnecessary. But by then, something had shifted in American kitchens. The war had taught a generation to adapt, to substitute, to make do with less and call it enough. And the capsule had taught something else, something quieter. It had taught that even small comforts, color, taste, texture, were never guaranteed, that they could be controlled, regulated, taken away, and that sometimes survival meant doing the work yourself, kneading the color in, pretending it was butter, pretending it was enough. The Callahan family kept using margarine into the 1950s. Not always, but often. Rose never talked about the capsules anymore. But sometimes, when she opened a new pound of pre-colored margarine, soft and yellow and ready to use, she paused, just for a moment, and she remembered. The margarine capsule faded from American life by the late 1950s. But its impact didn't. A generation of women, your grandmothers, maybe your mothers, grew up needing margarine. They learned thrift in a way that stayed with them. They learned to stretch ingredients, to substitute, to make do. And they passed those lessons down. Even decades after the war, older Americans preferred margarine. It was cheaper. It was familiar. It was what they knew. By the 1960s, margarine outsold butter in the United States. And it stayed that way for years. The habit had stuck. But there was something else, something less tangible. The capsule had taught a lesson about control, about how quickly something ordinary, something as simple as butter, could become scarce, could become regulated, could become work. And that lesson shaped how people thought about food, about waste, about saving. Even today, if you talk to someone who lived through the war years, someone in their 80s or 90s, they might tell you about the capsule, about kneading margarine at the kitchen table, about stained fingers and pale blocks of oily substitute, and the way their mother never complained, just worked the color in week after week. They might tell you they still remember the feel of it, the weight, the routine. And they might tell you quietly that they never take butter for granted, not even now. Rose Callahan lived until 1983. In her later years, she kept butter in the refrigerator, real butter, always, even when margarine was cheaper, even when her children suggested she switch to save money. "I did my time with margarine," she'd say, smiling faintly. "I'm done." But once, near the end of her life, her daughter Mary, now a grandmother herself, found an old cigar box in Rose's attic. Inside were ration books, yellowed and brittle, a few stamps still intact, and tucked in the corner, folded carefully, was a clipping from the Philadelphia Inquirer. February 1945. The letter from a tired mother. Mary brought it downstairs. "Mama, did you write this?" Rose looked at it. Her hands, frail now, trembling slightly. "No," she said softly, "but I could have." Mary sat beside her. It must have been hard. Rose was quiet for a long moment. It was, she said finally. But we managed. We always managed. And that perhaps was the real legacy of the capsule. Not the color it gave to margarine, not the loophole it represented, but the quiet resilience it demanded, the small, steady acts of survival it required. Week after week, year after year, until the war ended, and butter came back, and life slowly became a little easier. There's a question I'd like you to think about if you lived through those years, or if your mother did, or your grandmother. Do you remember the capsule? Not just the object itself, the little bead of orange dye, soft and fragile in your hand, but the feeling of it, the routine, the way it became part of the rhythm of the week, the way your mother's hands moved, kneading, folding, pressing until the pale block of margarine turned yellow, almost butter, almost normal. Do you remember the smell of it? The oily, faint vegetable scent that clung to your fingers? Do you remember the day butter came back? Because that capsule, that tiny, overlooked, forgotten capsule, it controlled more than you might think. It controlled how your family ate, how your mother planned meals, how you thought about food, about color, about what was real and what was substitute. It governed a small part of your survival, quietly, week after week, and then it was gone, replaced by margarine that came pre-colored, by butter that came back, by a world that slowly, unevenly returned to normal. But the memory stayed, the habit stayed, the lesson stayed. And maybe, just maybe, that's what objects like this are meant to teach us. Not just about history, not just about rationing or wartime or sacrifice, but about resilience, about the small acts of survival we perform without even noticing, about the quiet strength it takes to knead color into something pale and call it enough. The capsule is gone now. You won't find it in stores. You won't find it in museums, most likely. It's too small, too ordinary, too easily forgotten. But somewhere, tucked in an attic, in a cigar box, in the corner of a memory, it still exists. A tiny bead of orange dye, a compromise, a quiet rule, a reminder that even butter, golden, creamy, familiar butter, was never guaranteed, and that sometimes survival meant doing the work yourself.